The first sign that a swarm is dying is not fire, it is doubt. A drone racing through the dark does not feel fear, does not smell smoke, does not hear the scream of a missile passing close. But it does depend on something almost human, a sense of where it is, what is true, and what comes next. Now imagine that invisible sense begins to smear. The map is still there, but it drifts. The target marker twitches, then splits, then lags half a second behind the world. A command arrives late, another arrives twice, a third never comes at all. One drone banks left because the signal says danger. Another keeps flying because it never got the warning. A third climbs to avoid a threat that does not exist. From the outside, the swarm still looks fast, still looks sharp, still looks lethal. But inside the machine, something worse than panic is spreading. The shared picture is breaking apart. The swarm is going blind, not because anyone shot out its eyes, but because someone reached into the invisible air around it and poisoned reality itself. This is Battletech Declassified. Modern Warfare Explained. Tonight's battlefield is not just made of steel, fuel, blast waves, and broken concrete. It is made of timing, trust, and the electromagnetic spectrum, the hidden ocean every drone swims in, whether it knows it or not. When people imagine defending against a swarm, they picture bullets, lasers, missiles, and exploding targets dropping from the sky. But one of the most powerful defenses starts earlier, farther away, and often without a single visible detonation. Electronic warfare does not need to shred every incoming drone into burning fragments. It only has to do something subtler and, in many cases, cheaper. It has to make the swarm stop functioning like a swarm. It has to blur coordination, fracture navigation, jam the chain of command, and turn a synchronized attack into a loose pile of confused machines arriving at the wrong place, at the wrong time, with the wrong understanding of the fight. This episode is about how that happens, why it matters, and why in the age of cheap mass, the side that controls the invisible layer of war may decide the battle before the first interceptor ever leaves the rail. A swarm is dangerous for the same reason a school of fish can turn like one body, or a flock of birds can wheel across the sky without crashing into itself. The threat is not just in the number of machines. It is in coordination. One drone with a camera can be annoying, 10 can scout, 50 can probe. Hundreds, moving with shared timing and enough intelligence to spread roles across the group, become something much closer to a living system. Some carry cameras, some relay signals, some bait defenses. Some jam, some strike. Some simply exist to be sacrificed so the rest can get through. What turns this pile of cheap hardware into a serious military problem is not magic and not science fiction. It is the invisible glue holding the formation together. Links, signals, clocks, maps, identity checks, navigation references, and constant tiny updates about where each machine is and what each machine should do next. That is why electronic warfare matters so much. Think of the swarm as a pack of couriers trying to rob a city at once. If every courier knows the streets, knows the timing, knows who is leading, knows where the police are, and knows where the other couriers are going, the raid feels coordinated and overwhelming. But if street signs start lying, watches stop agreeing, radios dissolve into static, and false instructions slip into the network, the raid does not merely slow down, it loses shape. Couriers crash into the same alley, miss the bridge, hit the wrong block, or arrive one by one instead of all at once. In military terms, that means a defense no longer faces a synchronized wall of threats. It faces fragments, stragglers, separated vectors, wasted munitions, and exposed support drones. Electronic warfare attacks not only the body of the swarm, but its nervous system. That distinction changes everything, because destroying hardware is expensive, but sabotaging coordination can be enough to collapse the entire attack. This is why the phrase, blinding a swarm, is more powerful than it first sounds. Blindness here is not only about cameras losing image quality or sensors being dazzled. It is about the swarm no longer seeing the battlefield as a shared, trustworthy world. A drone can still have a working propeller, battery, warhead, and autopilot, yet be combat ineffective because it no longer knows where friendlies are, where defenses are firing from, or whether the target cue it just received is genuine. In modern combat, information is not a support layer floating above the battle. It is part of the battle itself. When that layer fractures, a swarm begins to behave less like a precision instrument and more like a handful of panicked runners in a smoke-filled maze. The beauty and danger of electronic warfare is that the effect can appear almost supernatural to anyone watching from the outside. There is no obvious bullet path, no visible wall, no giant shield in the sky. Drones just begin making bad choices. One orbits uselessly, another veers into empty terrain, a third drops altitude too early. A fourth freezes, waiting for confirmation that never arrives. A fifth speeds ahead alone and gets killed because the rest of the package is late. That is what makes the electromagnetic battlefield so deceptive. The decisive moment often looks boring until you understand what just happened. A commander who expected a saturated defense now sees gaps appear in the threat stream. A ship that was about to be overwhelmed suddenly deals with targets in manageable chunks. The kill chain stretches. The defense breathes. And all of it begins because someone understood a hard modern truth. In swarm warfare, reality is only useful if the machines agree on it. To understand how electronic warfare blinds a swarm, you have to stop thinking of the electromagnetic spectrum as a technical sidebar and start seeing it as terrain. Soldiers use hills, roads, rivers, and forests. Fleets use sea lanes, choke points, and radar horizons. Air forces use altitude, speed, and standoff range. But drones, missiles, and modern networks also move through another kind of terrain, a crowded, contested, invisible landscape made of frequencies, emissions, pulse timings, antenna patterns, bandwidth limits, and signal strength. This terrain has valleys where signals hide, mountains where interference dominates, choke points where too many systems compete for the same slice of spectrum, and ambush zones where a force that emits carelessly reveals itself. Electronic warfare is the art of fighting on that invisible terrain while denying the enemy freedom to move through it cleanly. That is why the old image of jamming as a single loud noise is too simple for the battlefield we are entering. Sometimes jamming really is brute force, like filling a room with so much noise that nobody can hear the instructions anymore. But often the smarter move is more surgical. Instead of shouting over every signal, you can trick receivers, corrupt timing, inject false confidence, imitate a trusted source, or force the enemy to fall back to slower, less capable modes. In other words, the goal is not always to smash the radio. The goal is to change the enemy's behavior. Make the swarm climb too high, spread too wide, burn extra battery, retransmit too often, hesitate too long, or hand off control at the worst moment. The smartest electronic attack does not merely interfere, it manipulates. It nudges the enemy into self-defeating decisions until the swarm spends its own energy solving problems you created for it. Now zoom in on what a swarm actually depends on. First, there is navigation. Most drones need some way to know where they are heading, and how that position relates to the route or target. That can come from satellite navigation, inertial systems, terrain cues, onboard sensors, or a mixture of all of them. Second, there is communication. Even a partially autonomous swarm often benefits from some combination of command uplinks, drone-to-drone coordination, target updates, health reporting, or relay nodes. Third, there is sensing, cameras, radar, passive detection, altimeters, data links, timing references, and all the little inputs that let one machine align its behavior with reality. And fourth, there is trust. Which signal is real? Which node is authoritative? Which update should be obeyed? Which contact is the target? If you can weaken those foundations, you do not need to physically destroy every machine to defeat the attack. A helpful analogy is to imagine a marching band trying to run through a city at night while performing. Navigation tells them which street to take. Communications tell them when to speed up, slow down, or split. Sensing tells them where the curbs, walls, and traffic are. Trust tells them which drumbeat to follow when echoes bounce off buildings and confusion grows. Electronic warfare attacks the sheet music, the streetlights, the radios in their ears, and sometimes even the rhythm itself. The musicians may all still be talented. Their instruments may still work. but the performance becomes ragged, then chaotic, then impossible. That is what defenders want from EW against a swarm. Not always instant annihilation. Sometimes a defender simply wants to ruin the performance so badly that cheap follow-on defenses, guns, short-range interceptors, lasers, or even geography can finish the job. One of the first levers in this fight is the command link. Many drones, especially lower-cost systems or systems operating in mixed control modes, rely on some form of link to a human operator, a relay platform, or a coordinating node. Break that link, and you force the drone into a backup behavior. Maybe it returns home. Maybe it hovers. Maybe it continues on a pre-planned route. Maybe it becomes less adaptive. Any of those can be useful to the defender. If the attacking system expected mid-course updates, live target refinement, or human approval before weapons release, then cutting the link is like cutting the puppet strings just before the puppet reaches the stage. The body still exists. The motion continues for a moment, but the precision disappears. The tricky part is that command links are not all the same. Some are simple and vulnerable. Some hop frequencies. Some use directional antennas. Some piggyback through other nodes. Some are designed to fail gracefully into autonomous modes precisely because designers know jamming is coming. This is why good electronic warfare starts with understanding the threat architecture, not just blasting energy into the sky and hoping for a miracle. Which links matter most? Which nodes are central? And which are expendable? Which transmitters reveal the swarm's logic? Which modes activate under pressure? A disciplined defender looks for the support beams inside the system. Knock out the wrong wall, and the structure barely notices. Knock out the right beam, and the whole attack changes shape. That is what separates cinematic push-button and everything falls fantasy from real modern electromagnetic combat. Then there is navigation, one of the most tempting targets in any drone campaign. A swarm that cannot orient itself is like a pack of runners inside a foggy stadium with spinning exit signs. Satellite navigation has obvious strengths: global availability, precision, simplicity of integration, and for many systems, a very attractive cost-to-performance balance. But that convenience creates vulnerability. Signals arriving from space are weak by the time they reach the surface. That means they can be jammed, masked, or, under the right conditions, spoofed. If a drone depends too heavily on those signals and lacks robust alternatives, a defender may not need to destroy it. The defender may simply need to make location uncertain. And uncertainty on a battlefield kills coordination. But again, the real effect is not binary. The drone does not always instantly fall out of the sky. More often, errors accumulate like tiny cracks spreading through ice. Position drift makes formation spacing worse. Timing errors disrupt synchronized arrival. Route corrections eat battery. Altitude confidence drops. A relay drone may no longer sit where the network expects it to be. A decoy package may separate from the strike package at the worst moment. One machine decides the target should be north of the ridge, another thinks it is south, and a third is no longer sure whether the ridge it sees is even the right ridge. That is why navigation warfare is so powerful. It weaponizes small errors. In a swarm, small errors do not stay small. They multiply across the group until the elegant mass attack you feared turns into a loose scatter of machines that no longer reinforce one another. A more advanced swarm may avoid some of those weaknesses by using onboard autonomy, inertial references, terrain matching, passive sensing, or drone-to-drone networking. That sounds intimidating, and it is, but it does not make the swarm immune. It just changes the problem. If one crutch disappears, the system leans harder on another. If GNSS becomes unreliable, now inertial drift matters more over time. If centralized command fades, now mesh reliability and local trust matter more. If long-range control becomes dangerous, now onboard target recognition and sensor fusion carry more weight. Every layer of resilience makes the system harder to kill with one trick, but it also reveals where the next pressure point may be. Think of it like a burglar breaking into a building with backup systems. The front door has an alarm, so he uses a side window. The side window is reinforced, so he tries the roof hatch. The roof hatch is locked, so he cuts power. A well-designed building forces the intruder to keep changing methods, and every forced adaptation costs time and raises the chance of failure. Defenders want the same effect against swarms. Electronic warfare does not have to solve every problem by itself. It only has to keep pushing the attacker into worse options. Fall back to less accurate navigation. Fall back to narrower communications. Fall back to simpler attack logic. Fall back to autonomous routines that are safe in theory but brittle under deception. Each fallback is a tax. Each tax slows the attack. And every second bought in the electromagnetic layer can be turned into survival in the physical one. Before you can blind a swarm, you often have to find it in the spectrum. This is where electronic support comes in, the quieter cousin of electronic attack. Instead of transmitting, electronic support listens. It watches for emissions, hunts patterns, identifies frequencies, tracks changes in signal behavior, and tries to understand what the enemy is doing by what the enemy is leaking into the air. A swarm may look anonymous at first, just a mass of cheap machines. But cheap does not mean silent. Every controller, relay, telemetry burst, navigation receiver, radar altimeter, or emergency fallback mode can leave fingerprints. Sometimes the most important step in electronic warfare is not shouting first, but staying still long enough to hear the enemy breathing. This is one reason professional electromagnetic combat feels more like stalking than brawling. A good defender wants to know when the swarm shifts modes, when a relay drone climbs for line of sight, when a decoy package starts emitting more aggressively, when a control node hands authority to a backup. Those changes are clues, and clues can become attack windows. Maybe you do not jam at the edge of the envelope, because that only warns the enemy early. Maybe you wait until the swarm compresses into a corridor where timing matters most. Maybe you target the relays instead of the shooters. Maybe you let the first wave commit before you corrupt the picture. Electronic support is the art of turning the enemy's own emissions into a map of vulnerability. In the invisible battlefield, listening is not passive. It is often the first move of the kill. When electronic attack begins, the most familiar method is noise jamming. This is the classic image, overwhelming a receiver with enough energy or enough interference in the right place that the signal it needs is buried. If the drone cannot hear the controller, cannot resolve a navigation reference, or cannot maintain a useful link, its performance degrades. Noise jamming is attractive because it can be straightforward, especially against unsophisticated or lightly protected systems. It is the battlefield equivalent of flooding a phone call with static until every instruction breaks into useless fragments. But the weakness of brute force jamming is that it can be loud in every sense. It takes power. It can reveal your location. It may interfere with friendly systems if used carelessly. And against a smart adversary, it can trigger adaptation. The swarm may switch frequencies, tighten beams, reduce dependence on the jammed channel, or use your own emissions as a clue about where you are. This is why louder is not always better. Smart electronic attack asks a harder question. What is the minimum disruption needed to produce the maximum behavioral failure? Sometimes that means only jamming for short windows. Sometimes it means targeting a narrow part of the chain, such as the uplink but not the downlink, or the handoff moment but not the whole flight. Winning in the spectrum is often less like smashing a wall with a hammer and more like slipping a stick into bicycle spokes at exactly the right second. Even more dangerous than noise is deception. Jamming says, "You cannot hear." Deception says, "You heard me, and you believed the wrong thing." That distinction matters because systems are often designed to notice missing information. They may have fallback behaviors for signal loss, but they can be far more fragile when fed believable false information. Spoofing navigation, imitating signals, generating phantom cues, manipulating timing, or feeding confidence-corrupting data can all push a swarm off its intended behavior without making the attack obvious at first. From the defender's perspective, this is ideal. A confused enemy often wastes more opportunity than a merely disconnected one. Imagine a convoy driving through a city using digital navigation. If the map disappears, every driver knows something is wrong. They slow down, call for help, and become cautious. But if the map remains visible while quietly shifting every turn by 2 streets, disaster unfolds with far more momentum. Drivers commit to wrong routes, the convoy stretches, vehicles separate. Some enter dead ends. Others drive straight into traffic. That is what deception can do to a swarm. It can preserve confidence just long enough for the system to betray itself. A drone still thinks it is on plan. The formation still believes its geometry is intact. The strike package still assumes its timing works. Then the moment comes. The final approach, the synchronized dive, the relay handoff, and the whole attack reveals that it has been fighting a ghost version of the battlefield. There is another reason deception matters so much against swarms. Trust is expensive. A large distributed system needs shortcuts. It cannot endlessly verify every packet, every queue, every node, and every timing pulse under combat pressure without sacrificing speed. Designers try to balance resilience and responsiveness, but war punishes assumptions. If one drone accepts a false timing reference, and that error propagates through local coordination, the problem can spread. If one relay begins forwarding corrupted data, nearby nodes may reorganize around a poisoned center. If the swarm's logic depends on local consensus, then poisoning consensus can be more devastating than killing one airframe. This is why electronic warfare can feel strangely biological. In medicine, a body can survive cuts, bruises, and even the loss of tissue, but it struggles when signaling systems inside the body are disrupted. Nerves misfire. Hormones arrive at the wrong concentration. Feedback loops overreact. The body begins harming itself. Swarms can suffer the same kind of internal betrayal. They do not need every drone destroyed to fail. They only need enough internal mismatch that the group starts amplifying error instead of performance. One drone interprets silence as attack authorization. Another interprets it as abort. One widens spacing to avoid collision. Another tightens spacing to preserve network strength. The more dynamic the attack becomes, the more dangerous those mismatches are. This is what defenders are trying to induce, not just signal loss, but internal contradiction. Of course, smart adversaries know this. That is why modern swarm concepts increasingly push autonomy down to the edge. The less a drone needs constant instruction, the harder it is to paralyze by simply cutting the cord. A drone that can classify terrain, maintain route discipline, recognize broad target categories, avoid obstacles, and continue on mission with incomplete information is much more dangerous than a drone waiting obediently for every update. That trend matters because it means electronic warfare must evolve from break the link and win into something more nuanced. Against advanced swarms, the defender must decide what behavior to trigger when the obvious link attack no longer guarantees collapse. But autonomy is not invincibility. It is a trade. The more decisions pushed onboard, the more the machine depends on onboard assumptions, onboard sensor quality, and onboard interpretation of uncertain reality. That creates new openings. Autonomous systems can still be lured into false classifications, forced into conservative behaviors, steered away from ideal paths, or made to burn resources solving ambiguity. If a human operator is not constantly correcting, then the machine is living more fully inside its own model of the world, and any model, no matter how advanced, can be manipulated. A swarm that shrugs off simple jamming may still be blinded by a defense that attacks confidence, synchronization, and perception instead of just control. The invisible fight becomes less about unplugging the machine and more about teaching it the wrong lesson at the worst possible moment. This brings us to one of the deepest truths of counter-swarm warfare. Timing matters more than spectacle. Defenders do not merely want drones to fail, they want them to fail out of sequence. A saturated attack works because too many threats arrive too close together for the defense to process, assign, and kill in time. Electronic warfare can break that compression. It can separate what was supposed to arrive as one punch into a series of weaker taps. It can make the decoys appear too early, the shooters too late, the relays too high, the scouts too far, and the final attackers too isolated to matter. In other words, blinding a swarm is often really about stretching it. Picture a boxer throwing a perfect combination: jab, cross, hook, uppercut, with all 4 punches arranged so the defender cannot reset between them. Now imagine an invisible hand adds just a small delay between each strike. Not enough for the boxer to realize immediately, just enough for rhythm to die. Suddenly the defender sees the jab, blocks the cross, slips the hook, and braces for the uppercut. The same fists are still there, the same muscles still move, but the combination no longer overwhelms. That is what timing disruption does to a swarm. It breaks the rhythm that made mass dangerous. Once rhythm is gone, Almost every other defensive layer gets stronger because humans, sensors, and weapon systems regain the thing saturation was meant to steal from them: decision space. And decision space is the real currency of defense. Every ship, airbase, convoy, or forward outpost under swarm threat is fighting a clock. Sensors must detect. Software must classify. Humans must trust the classification. Weapons must be assigned. Geometry must work. Interceptors must arrive before impact. The attacking swarm tries to collapse that timeline until the defense chokes. Electronic warfare does the opposite. It buys time, not by making the defender faster in an absolute sense, but by making the attacker slower, less coherent, less certain, and less synchronized. A few extra seconds may sound trivial in peacetime. In saturation combat, a few extra seconds can be the difference between an orderly engagement and a cascading disaster. This is why soft kill effects can be so strategically valuable, even when they look unimpressive in footage. A kinetic kill is easy to understand because it leaves a burning object. A soft kill may leave no dramatic image at all. Yet if that soft kill caused a relay to drift, caused a target package to reroute, caused a salvo to deconflict badly, or caused a strike window to miss the exact second when a ship's defensive magazine was most stressed, then it may have done more for survival than one spectacular missile intercept. Modern war increasingly rewards the force that sees invisible leverage, the force that keeps asking not, "How do I destroy every incoming object?" but "How do I make the enemy's system stop behaving like a system?" That is the mindset shift electronic warfare demands. Now place this inside a naval scenario where the geometry becomes brutal. A warship at sea is both powerful and exposed. It carries sensors, weapons, and defensive software, but it also emits, maneuvers within constraints, and can be found against a relatively uncluttered backdrop. An incoming swarm tries to exploit every weakness at once. Sea skimming approaches, false bearings, cheap decoys, relay nodes, pop-up angles, and the simple mathematics of too many objects arriving in too little time. The defender cannot afford to waste precious interceptors on every cheap threat, nor can it assume every track is what it seems. Electronic warfare becomes a way to shape the fight before hard-kill weapons shoulder the burden. At sea, blinding the swarm can mean making the attackers lose confidence in the ship's location, distorting their path over water where small errors matter, corrupting their coordination so the decoys no longer screen the shooters effectively, or forcing the whole attack package to expose itself in ways that radar and optical systems can exploit. Water also plays tricks, with reflections, horizons, and line of sight. The electromagnetic battle is not happening in a clean laboratory. It is happening in a messy, dynamic environment where physics itself becomes part of the contest. That is why professional defenders think in layers. They do not ask whether EW replaces missiles or guns. They ask how EW can make every later layer cheaper, calmer, and more lethal. In the best case, electronic attack does not end the battle. It rearranges it into a battle the ship can actually survive. This is where economics enters the story. Swarms are terrifying partly because they exploit cost asymmetry. The attacker wants to spend little and force the defender to spend much. Cheap drones, cheap seekers, cheap airframes, cheap decoys, expensive radar attention, expensive missiles, expensive human stress. That exchange can break a defender even before a platform is physically lost. Electronic warfare pushes back by fighting at the logic level instead of the metal level. If one burst of carefully applied disruption can spoil the coordination of many incoming systems at once, then the economics begin to shift. Suddenly, the defender is no longer paying premium prices for every single object in the sky. The analogy here is a nightclub bouncer facing a mob. If he tries to physically tackle every unruly person one by one, he gets overwhelmed. But if he can shut the right door, kill the lights in the right corridor, create confusion at the right choke point, or split the crowd into smaller clusters before they reach the entrance, his job becomes possible. Electronic warfare is that choke point logic applied to the spectrum. It looks less dramatic than punching every attacker in the face, but it changes the ratio. Against mass, changing the ratio is often more important than winning any single duel. That is why countries under drone pressure care so much about soft kill systems, sensing, jammers, decoys, spectrum management, and rapid adaptation. The goal is not to perform heroics forever. The goal is to avoid losing the math. But no defender should romanticize electronic warfare as a magic cloak. The spectrum is contested, crowded, and full of trade-offs. Jamming can interfere with friendly communications. Deception can create doubt inside your own network if not managed carefully. Powerful emissions can announce your position to an enemy that is also listening. A swarm may include sacrificial scouts precisely to map your electronic response. The moment you transmit, you join the conversation. And in war, every conversation is exploitable. So the real skill is not merely having EW systems. It is integrating them into a disciplined concept of operations. In practical terms, that means knowing when to stay silent, when to surge, when to relocate, when to coordinate with kinetic fires, and when to let one layer carry the burden while another layer preserves surprise. It means training crews to understand the invisible side effects of their own actions. It means recognizing that electronic warfare is not a toy box of gadgets but a form of maneuver. You can feint with it, you can screen with it, you can bait with it. You can overuse it and teach the enemy your habits, or you can use it with enough timing and restraint that the enemy never quite understands why its attacks keep losing coherence. The strongest spectrum fighter is not always the loudest. It is often the one that turns emissions into strategy instead of spectacle. Another powerful way to blind a swarm is to attack its relays and dependencies instead of the most obvious shooters. In many distributed attacks, not every drone is equally important. Some are merely present. Others are structural. A relay drone extending range, a scouting drone refreshing the target picture, a timing node stabilizing the group, a decoy creating false confidence, these can matter more than one extra explosive airframe. Kill or disrupt the wrong drone and the swarm shrugs. Disrupt the right one and half the group starts making progressively worse decisions. This is the invisible equivalent of cutting the lead climber's rope instead of trying to punch every climber on the mountain. That is why defenders increasingly think in terms of function, not just count. How many drones are there is an important question, but not the most important one. What roles are present? Which nodes create disproportionate value? Which machines maintain coherence? Which ones are good enough to sacrifice, and which ones must survive for the attack to stay elegant? Electronic warfare becomes especially potent when paired with that functional understanding. You are no longer blindly swatting at the cloud. You are looking for the joints in the skeleton. And once you find them, the defender's job gets much easier. Blind the scouts, and the shooters arrive with stale data. Corrupt the relays, and the outer wave stops supporting the inner wave. Force one key node into backup mode, and suddenly the whole swarm becomes more local, more fragmented, and easier to defeat piecemeal. Is less than #0. 5# is greater than. Terrain and clutter matter too, even for airborne attacks. Urban canyons, coastlines, ridgelines, weather, sea state, reflections, and civilian spectrum congestion can all shape the electromagnetic fight. A swarm moving over open water behaves differently from one weaving through urban clutter. A jammer on a hill does not see the same problem as a jammer tucked into a valley. A defender surrounded by civilian emitters may have more camouflage, but also more confusion. This is why what works in one theater may disappoint in another. Electronic warfare is always local. Physics sets the stage, and the stage changes everything. For a swarm, local conditions can become traps. A route chosen for low radar visibility may produce poor link quality. A valley chosen for concealment may block relay geometry. A coastline chosen for approach cover may distort navigation confidence under heavy interference. Defenders who understand this do not merely jam generically, they shape the enemy into bad terrain. They open corridors that look safe, but are electronically dangerous. They make one lane feel quiet, so the swarm compresses there. Then they disrupt at the point of maximum dependence. Good EW planners think like hunters setting a funnel. The prey believes it is choosing the safest path. In reality, it is being guided toward the place where its invisible senses are weakest and the defender's control is strongest. This is also why decoys and false signals can pair so well with electronic attack. A swarm already under uncertainty is much easier to misdirect. If communication is degraded and navigation confidence is low, then even a modest false cue may look attractive. A decoy emitter, a false target signature, a manipulated cue that suggests an opening or a weakness. These can pull parts of the swarm away from the true axis of effort. The defender does not need every drone to believe the lie. It may only need enough of them to fracture the mass. Once the attack separates, the surviving portion becomes easier to classify and kill. Think of a pack of wolves closing on a herd at dusk. If the herd stays compact and the wolves stay coordinated, the outcome is grim. But if dust, shadows, and false movement make some wolves veer left and others hold center while a few sprint too early, the pack loses the compression that made it dangerous. That is what decoys can do in electronic warfare. They are not just fake objects. They are tools for reshaping enemy confidence. Used at the right moment, they can make the swarm commit its own strength in the wrong direction. And that may be the cleanest kind of victory in modern defense. Not shooting down every attacker after it commits perfectly, but making the attacker spend its perfection in the wrong place. Then there is sensor blinding in the literal sense. Some swarms rely heavily on optical seekers, infrared cues, radar altimeters, or other onboard sensors during terminal phases. Disrupting those can be enough to degrade final accuracy even if the broader navigation chain remains partially intact. A drone that can reach the target area but cannot confidently identify, track, or aim at the correct object is still a degraded threat. Against some systems, dazzling, obscuration, spoofing, or saturation of sensor inputs may create the final layer of uncertainty needed to spoil the strike. The important idea is that blindness can occur at different levels. Strategic blindness is when the swarm does not understand the battle space. Operational blindness is when the package loses coherence en route. Tactical blindness is when the individual airframe fails in the final seconds of target recognition or terminal guidance. A good defender tries to stack these. Maybe early jamming weakens timing. Mid-course deception widens spacing. Terminal sensor disruption then causes the surviving shooters to miss or hit decoys. Each layer alone may be imperfect. Together they become something more powerful, a cumulative loss of confidence. By the time the drones reach the defended asset, they are no longer entering the fight as sharp, synchronized hunters. They are arriving as tired, uncertain machines trying to solve too many problems at once. This is one reason electronic warfare rarely works best alone. Its true strength often appears when paired with kinetic defense, deception, maneuver, and disciplined command and control. If EW can delay, separate, and confuse the swarm, then guns and missiles get cleaner shots. If decoys can pull part of the package sideways, then jammers can focus on a smaller slice. If a ship can maneuver to change geometry just as a relay gets disrupted, the swarm may lose line of sight at the worst possible second. Modern defense is less about finding one miracle weapon and more about choreographing several modest advantages into a system failure for the attacker. That system view matters because adversaries learn. A swarm campaign is not one duel frozen in time. It is a conversation of adaptation. One side jams, the other hardens links. One side spoofs navigation, the other adds terrain matching. One side attacks relays, the other distributes authority. This means the defender's real objective is not only to win today's engagement, but to remain difficult to model tomorrow. If the attacker can predict exactly how you jam, when you emit, and what you prioritize, then your electronic warfare becomes part of its plan. So the best defenders cultivate variation. They do not just carry EW capability. They make that capability tactically ambiguous. The enemy should never be fully sure whether the blindness it is experiencing comes from noise, deception, missing nodes, false cues, or its own internal fragility. There is also a more dangerous side to this fight. Some attackers can use your electronic activity against you. A classic example is the idea of home on jam, where a seeker or logic path exploits the very emissions intended to interfere with it. Even when systems do not literally home on a jammer, emissions can still reveal location, posture, and intent. A defender broadcasting confidently may solve one problem while creating another. That does not mean electronic warfare is a bad idea. It means electronic warfare is a duel, not a cheat code. Every move creates information. Every interference pattern tells a story. So professional forces train in mission control for the same reason good hunters watch their footprints. Sometimes the best spectrum move is restraint, listening, relocating, using directional effects, transmitting late, or cycling through unpredictable patterns so the enemy cannot build a clean picture. Blinding a swarm, then, is not simply about power. It is about discipline. A nervous defender may light up the sky too early and too broadly, teaching the enemy where the weak points are and exhausting precious options before the real attack arrives. A patient defender waits, shapes, and strikes where the payoff is highest. In the age of autonomous mass, patience is strangely modern. Invisible battles are often won by the side that resists the urge to react loudly before it understands what kind of attack it is actually facing. Electronic protection sits on the other side of this contest. If electronic attack is about blinding the enemy, electronic protection is about keeping your own eyes open while the enemy tries the same tricks on you. That means hardening links, designing graceful fallbacks, training operators to recognize spoofing, protecting navigation with multiple references, using better filters, smarter software, antenna discipline, spectrum awareness, and redundancy that does not simply duplicate one weakness across 10 devices. In other words, if you want your own swarm or defensive network to survive, you must assume the enemy is trying to poison your reality too. This matters because counter-swarm defense itself increasingly depends on networks, distributed sensors, autonomous pickets, remote shooters, and machine speed coordination. The defender can become as dependent on the spectrum as the attacker. That creates a strange mirror. You are trying to blind the swarm while preventing the swarm, or its supporting EW layer, from blinding you. It is like two fencers dueling in a dark room where each also controls parts of the lighting. Who sees clearly longest? Who can tell the difference between real contact and planted illusion? Who can keep trust inside the team when the battlefield starts lying? Modern warfare increasingly rewards the force that can fight through ambiguity without freezing. That is why resilience matters just as much as disruption. The side that can keep operating while confused usually beats the side that needs a perfect picture to function. Now imagine the defense is not centered only on one ship or one base, but spread across a wider defensive web. Picket drones, remote sensors, passive listeners, forward decoys, offboard jammers, and distributed launchers all extend the fight outward. This changes everything. Instead of waiting for the swarm to reach the defended asset before the invisible battle begins, the defender can start shaping the attack much earlier. One node listens, another tempts emissions. A third disrupts a relay. A fourth feeds tracking data back to the main force without loudly declaring itself. The swarm enters not one defended bubble, but a layered maze of uncertainty. This distributed model is especially powerful because it attacks one of the swarm's core advantages, compression against a single point. If the defender's sensing and EW effects are also distributed, then the swarm has a harder time finding one center to saturate. It may jam one node and still be watched by another. It may kill one picket and reveal itself to a passive listener farther back. It may route around the obvious threat only to enter a quieter trap. The future of anti-swarm warfare is likely to look less like a castle wall and more like a web. In that web, electronic warfare is the silk you cannot see, shaping movement, signaling danger, and making the sky feel less like open freedom and more like a place full of invisible hands. There is also a command problem hidden inside all of this. Who decides when to jam, what to jam, and how much uncertainty is acceptable? In the movies, a commander pushes a button, and the right effect happens instantly. Real combat is uglier. Jamming the wrong band may interfere with friendly traffic. Delaying too long may surrender initiative. Acting too early may expose the defense plan. Acting too late may mean the hard kill layer faces the swarm at full strength. So, doctrine, training, and authority matter. Electronic warfare is not just a technical capability. It is a decision process under time pressure. This is another reason swarms are so threatening. They do not simply challenge radar or missiles. They challenge the tempo of human judgment. They force defenders to decide amid incomplete information whether a cluster is a decoy, a scout, a real strike package, or a mixed formation designed to manipulate exactly those decisions. The best electronic warfare in the world can still fail if command relationships are slow, confused, or timid. On the other hand, A merely good EW capability can become formidable in the hands of a force that has rehearsed decision thresholds, understood likely threat behaviors, and empowered operators to act inside tight windows. In saturation combat, excellence often looks like preparation more than genius. You cannot improvise trust and speed after the swarm is already in your face. Friendly interference is one of the least glamorous but most important realities in this entire story. A modern force does not operate one radio, one radar, and one clean signal path. It operates a dense ecosystem of emitters, receivers, links, data pipes, and competing priorities. That means every electronic attack carries risk. Jam broadly, and you may blind your own sensors, degrade your own network, or create confusion in the very defensive web meant to save you. This is why electromagnetic discipline is not optional. It is the hidden maintenance of modern combat power. Imagine an orchestra trying to perform while also sabotaging an enemy orchestra in the next room. If your own musicians cannot hear the conductor because you turned up the noise too high, then you have won nothing. Good spectrum management is what keeps your sabotage from becoming self-harm. This sounds technical, but it is deeply human. It depends on planning, rehearsal, clear priorities, and people who understand second-order effects. The side that treats EW as a shiny gadget often stumbles here. The side that treats the spectrum as a shared battle space, as real as roads, fuel, or magazine depth, is far more dangerous. It can disrupt the enemy without unraveling itself. And in a world of dense networks and autonomous systems, that may be the difference between a force that merely owns electronic gear and a force that truly knows how to fight with it. Now let's walk through a battle. Midnight over dark water. A destroyer is running a tense transit through a corridor everyone knows is contested. The sea is black glass in some directions and broken silver in others. Radar operators have already spent hours sorting fishing clutter, weather echoes, and uncertain contacts. Then the pattern changes. Small tracks appear at the edge of confidence, low, scattered, not yet alarming in count, but wrong in behavior. A few climb, then flatten. One vanishes, then returns farther along than it should. Another lingers, just enough to feel like bait. This does not look like one drone. It looks like a question being asked in stages. The ship answers by listening harder. Passive systems, search for emissions. Direction finding angles sharpen. A relay signature flickers and disappears. The command team realizes the attack is building before the sky looks crowded. They do not fire immediately. That restraint is the first victory. Instead, the ship waits for the swarm to reveal its structure. The farther scouts are tolerated. The likely relays are watched. Defensive emitters remain controlled. Then the pattern clarifies. What looked like scattered noise is organizing into lanes. One group is probing the flanks. Another is edging into a better line-of-sight posture. A third remains distant, almost polite, which is exactly what makes it suspicious. At last, the ship's commander understands the shape of the raid. This is not one blunt rush. It is a layered approach, meant to stretch defenses and create uncertainty about what to shoot first. That is the moment the invisible battle begins in earnest, not with a roar, but with a decision. The first electronic attack does not target everything. It targets the architecture. A controlled burst pressures the likely relay path. Not enough to advertise panic. Enough to test behavior. Two distant tracks wobble in spacing. One climbs unexpectedly. That is confirmation. The ship now knows which part of the swarm is doing more than carrying explosives. A second wave of carefully timed interference hits the route where timing matters most, the corridor narrowing toward the ship's expected track. The result is subtle at first. The probing flank arrives too early. The central lane compresses less neatly. A cluster that should have been offset for deconfliction now crowds itself. The attackers are still dangerous, but they are no longer elegant. Then deception enters. False cues, false confidence, just enough poisoned certainty to make some machines believe the target solution is cleaner off-axis than it really is. A portion of the swarm begins drifting toward a decoy geometry. Another portion hesitates, trying to preserve network coherence. That hesitation is gold. Radar classification improves because arrival windows are widening. Fire control is no longer gasping. The destroyer's hard kill systems, which would have faced a near simultaneous wall of trouble, now meet staggered knots of targets instead. Guns engage the closest strays. Missiles are saved for the still dangerous shooters. What changed the math was not a single spectacular kill. It was the moment the swarm stopped believing the same story about the battlefield. But the battle is not over. Smart attackers adapt. Some drones fall back to simpler autonomous behaviors. Others stop trusting the corrupted cues and push along pre-planned attack lines. A few sacrificial units sprint ahead, less useful as coordinated weapons than as sensors designed to force the ship to reveal more of its defensive rhythm. This is the next layer of the duel. The defender has landed the first invisible punch, and now the attacker is deciding what pain it can tolerate. In that sense, electronic warfare behaves like pressure on a lock. The first twist may not open the door. It reveals which pins move, which stick, and where the mechanism is weakest. So the ship changes tempo. Instead of trying to blanket the battle space continuously, it pulses. Silence. Burst. Silence. Shift. Another burst. Different sector. Different timing. The goal is no longer only disruption. It is ambiguity. The remaining attackers must keep asking themselves whether the environment is currently safe, whether the corridor ahead is truly clear, whether the network drift they are seeing is temporary or terminal. Under that uncertainty, autonomy becomes heavier, not lighter. Every onboard decision now carries more burden. Some drones commit and die. Some overcorrect and miss their windows. Some survive long enough to become isolated threats, still lethal, but no longer part of a coordinated overwhelm. That is the key transformation. The defender has not erased danger. It has reduced mass back into individual problems. This is the part audiences often miss. Blinding a swarm does not necessarily mean every drone becomes helpless. Some will still get through. Some will still strike. Some may even succeed enough to damage the defended force. War is rarely clean. The value of electronic warfare is not that it promises perfection. The value is that it changes catastrophe into a fight. It transforms an elegant, synchronized, economically brutal attack into something clumsier, slower, more expensive, and easier to survive. That sounds modest, but in real combat, survival is often a modest thing. It is the difference between a ship crippled and a ship still maneuvering, between a base overrun and a base still defending, between magazine panic and disciplined fire control. There is wisdom in that humility. Forces that expect flawless shields tend to break when reality intrudes. Forces that understand defense as a series of managed imperfections adapt better. Electronic warfare belongs inside that mindset. It buys windows, not miracles. It creates uncertainty for the enemy while forcing hard choices on both sides. And because it works on the logic of the attack, not just the hardware, it can create disproportionate value. A few degrees of route error, a few seconds of delay, a lost relay, a poisoned cue. These are tiny things in isolation, but war is often decided by whether tiny things line up. The whole point of blinding a swarm is to ensure they do not. Zoom back out, and the doctrine shift becomes clear. The old defensive instinct is platform-centered. Protect the ship. Protect the base, protect the convoy. Build rings around the valuable object and hope the rings hold. But swarms force a broader view. The real battle begins before the first ring. It begins in the sensing web, the passive listeners, the decoys, the electronic support teams, the spectrum managers, the offboard nodes, the remote jammers, and the human operators who understand that the defended asset is only the center of gravity, not the whole battlefield. If you wait until the swarm is fully formed and fully committed, you are already late. That is why future counter-swarm defense is drifting toward kill webs rather than isolated platforms. Every node contributes. One hears, one misleads, one delays, one shoots, one confirms. One stays silent to preserve surprise. This webbed logic also mirrors the swarm itself. In a strange way, the best defense against distributed mass is a better distributed defense. Electronic warfare is central to that because it is inherently connective. It links sensing, timing, maneuver, deception, and weapons into one choreography. It is not just another gadget strapped onto a ship. It is part of the nervous system of the defense. And the side with the better nervous system often beats the side with the flashier fists. There is a final economic lesson here too. Building enough hard kill capacity to physically destroy every cheap incoming object can be ruinously expensive. Building a layered defense that includes robust electronic warfare, passive sensing, distributed decoys, and selective kinetic engagement may still be costly, but it is a smarter cost. It spreads the burden across different mechanisms instead of forcing every problem through the most expensive tool. In the long run, that matters at least as much as any single battle. Wars of mass are also wars of production, maintenance, training, and sustainable exchange ratios. A defense that cannot afford to keep defending is not a defense. Electronic warfare helps because it scales strangely well against some forms of mass. One carefully placed disruption can affect many attackers. One deception can fracture 100 machines more efficiently than 100 separate missile shots. That does not eliminate the need for hard-kill weapons, but it changes how often and under what conditions they must be used. For militaries preparing for the drone age, this is one of the most important mindset shifts of all. Stop thinking only in terms of how many objects you can shoot down. Start thinking in terms of how many attack plans you can ruin. The first model counts wreckage. The second model counts failed enemy decisions. In modern war, the second count may matter more. And what about the human being in all this? The crew member staring at a screen full of uncertain contacts, the commander deciding whether the pattern is real, the operator choosing whether to pulse or stay silent, the analyst listening for the slight fingerprint of a relay in the noise. These people remain central. Swarm warfare is often described as machine versus machine, algorithm versus algorithm, autonomy versus autonomy. But the hardest moments still belong to humans, confronting ambiguity under pressure. Electronic warfare does not remove that burden. It changes its shape. It turns some of combat's loudest problems into quiet judgment calls made under invisible stress. That is why training matters so much. Not just technical training, but cognitive training. The ability to notice pattern shifts, trust disciplined procedures, resist panic, and understand that invisible effects are real effects. A crew that only believes in explosions will undervalue what EW is doing for them. A crew that understands timing, uncertainty, and system behavior will recognize the signs of a breaking swarm before anyone else. In the future, survival may depend as much on how well forces think about the spectrum as how well they shoot. The battlefield is becoming more abstract without becoming less deadly. And that means military competence must expand too. You do not just need sharper missiles, you need sharper minds. So here is the core truth. A swarm is not dangerous only because it flies. It is dangerous because it shares a picture, shares timing, shares confidence, and compresses violence into a window too tight for defenders to manage. Electronic warfare breaks that compression by attacking the invisible things the swarm depends on most. It denies clean navigation. It corrupts trust. It disrupts relays. It fractures timing. It stretches arrival. It poisons certainty. And once certainty is gone, even a large swarm can begin to behave like a crowd of strangers sprinting through smoke, all armed, all moving, but no longer truly together. That is why the future of defense will belong not only to the side that can build the most drones, the fastest missiles, or the boldest autonomy, but to the side that understands the invisible layer better than anyone else. In the wars ahead, the decisive shield may not be the loudest weapon on the deck. It may be the silent hand that makes the enemy see the wrong map, hear the wrong voice, trust the wrong cue, and arrive 1 second too late, 1 mile too far, 1 formation apart. Because in the age of massed machines, blindness is not merely the loss of sight, it is the loss of shared reality. And once a swarm loses that, it can still fly, but it may no longer know how to win.